Welcome back, Michael Coren. Barbara Kay, columnist for the National Post once a week, but writes elsewhere on the internet and blogging and so on. I'm not saying this just because she's here. She's only here because I would say something like I think she's one of the best, most courageous and original voices out there. Now, I have to say, most voices are so dull and dumb. I mean, you look at a roundup of columns, and it's two opinions expressed, and 30 people just repeating the same old mediocre nonsense. Let's move on to the issue of... let's speak about feminism here, because surely your success, your triumph, is a product of the feminist struggle. You're a free, independent woman, you can write what you want. But you seem quite hard on shall we say, hardline feminism.
I am. I consider feminism actually a very pernicious ideology. And I do think it is the ruling ideology of our time. And if you look at other struggles, gay rights, all this, it all becomes subsumed under the general rubric of feminism. It's the best organized revolution I've ever seen. It's a bloodless revolution. Its declared enemies gave up without a fight. They declared themselves, you know, prisoners of war without even having to be rounded up. And because it is now entrenched in all educational levels, we are now, because it's now 40 years on, we're seeing the fruits of that revolution in the corridors of power, in all institutions where of educational influence, in the bar, where, you know, the majority of lawyers are now women, and many of them go into teaching law because they are strongly ideological. We see the influence all the way up to the Supreme Court. We see it in our social service agencies. We see it in our charities. We see it. There is no institution left in Canada that is not heavily influenced by feminism, and politicians pay court to. They know that there's a lot of bad things will happen if you don't. You know, if you're someone seeking power, this is one of the one of the groups that you really have to pay attention to. Because it is an ideology, and a revolutionary ideology that never ends, and because it is entrenched in the educational system, notably within women's studies, now called gender studies most of the time, but it's the same old stuff, in our universities, it permeates our society.
But let's define what it is, because for many people it would be equality of opportunity, same pay for the same effort and work done, an awareness of domestic violence, rights within marriage, and these would all be self-evident truths now. It's a popular assumption.
Well, I mean, yes, and it is. It started out that way. In the early years of the movement, it did begin as an equality movement. Please don't get the impression that I think the accomplishments of the feminist revolution are bad or wrong. I mean, obviously, but to say that I could speak my mind because of feminism simply isn't true. I actually grew up in a pre-feminist society. I went to university in a pre-feminist environment. I competed against men at university. I was never treated as a second-class citizen by my male professors. So that's all nonsense, this whole thing that women, before feminism came along, had no voice or had no power. They had different kinds of power. But let's grant that the feminist revolution is responsible for equal pay and all these other wonderful opportunities. And of course, equal opportunity is something. Who could be more in favor of it than you and me? I mean, you know, you and I. No, you and me. You and I. Anyways, it went well beyond that. When you get to second stage feminism, you're now getting into a kind of militancy where it's not about equality for women. It's about women's interests and getting more. It becomes a zero-sum game. If men have any advantages, then they're taking it away from women. Now, this is just a wrong way to look at society. So it sets up an adversarial system where any rights men have, if women do not have at least equal rights, then they're being shafted. And we see now, for instance, in universities where you have courses, especially in arts, 70% women, 80%, some are up to 90% women, but everybody's extremely quiet about it. Isn't this bad for men? Well, they don't care. They really don't care. As long as they're getting what's good for women, men can look after themselves, and they keep saying, oh, it's a man's world, it's a man's world. You know, this just isn't true anymore. Sociologically speaking, it's very much a woman's world. You mentioned domestic violence. This is something I write about a lot because there's tremendous injustice in this area. There are, what, 500-something shelters for women, not one for men. Men suffer from domestic violence almost to the same degree that women do. Canadian Stats Canada shows domestic violence is bilateral. It's almost 50-50. Yes, women, when it gets to the violence stage, which, by the way, is extremely marginal. If you look at the whole domestic violence picture, and you look at the number of extreme acts of violence, it's so nugatory that we should set that aside. General violence, hitting, smacking, slapping, knifing, all this stuff is almost 50-50. Men don't talk about it. Men won't go to the hospital and say why they're there with blood oozing out of them. You know, they'll say they had an accident. Women are more violent to children than men are. You don't hear about any of this because it's one of those closed subjects.
Isn't it because women spend more time with children?
Doesn't matter. What it does show you is that women are capable of violence. So if they're capable of violence with children, why wouldn't they be capable of violence with men? They are. They're capable of violence with their boyfriends. So it's one of those things you're not allowed to talk about. There are men who have nowhere to take their abused children to protect them from their mothers because there are no shelters that will accept. You can't go to the Salvation Army with a kid. Women's shelters will accept women with their children fleeing an abusive husband, but a father who wants to protect his small children from an abusive mother, there is nowhere that he can go. He will be accused of kidnapping. And now that is a very iniquitous situation. So there's a lot of injustice. Family court. Women have the advantage, it's a shocking advantage in custody issues in family court, and you know, there's a bookshelf's been written on this subject, but it doesn't get into the public forum. It's not open for discussion. We've now got to the stage where the best interests of the children now coincide with the best interests of mothers. That's really the received wisdom on this subject. Fathers are a forgotten group. It's an orphan topic in the media. I write about it as often as I can, but you know, if I write about it too much, then I begin to look like a ranter and an obsessive. But it's certainly one of the subjects very close to my heart because I think that it's just it's like a taboo subject, and things that men's pain is just not noticed, and it's not cared about, and that's one of those things that we've just sort of accepted. It's part of the air we breathe. It's what I call misandry. There is a kind of dislike of men. I shouldn't say hatred, but a sort of feeling men don't matter. Men can be laughed at, men can be ridiculed, men can be spoken of as a group, as being violent, or look, the Montreal Massacre, perfect example. The White Ribbon Campaign and the whole educational system is full of the idea that men are inherently violent, that Marc Lepine is kind of somehow representative of a strain in men that is almost universal. That's a terrible thing to say about any visible group. I think that it is a very divisive philosophy.
I just want to ask you two things about the Montreal Massacre. One is that the Islamic context of the murderer has been expunged from this story.
Yes.
The name that he originally had and his father's name and so on. The other aspect is the men who allowed the women to be separated and even allowed someone to... I mean, I would not be a hero, but if a group of us ran to stop something, I would certainly join in. They allowed this person to reload. They said yes to something which people have said no to for many, many years, and we've always condemned collaborators. Is that also the latter a byproduct of the feminist victory, that men felt emasculated? And why is the media so terrified to mention that this man had any Islamic connection in his past?
Well, the Islamic part, they're terrified to mention it because that would put them in a very bad double bind, because if you talk about him as a generic male, then you can say, oh, he's violent, he's this, he's that, and all men share in his shame. But if the Islamic name is allowed in, then suddenly you're saying Muslims are violent. Ooh, we can't have that. So I think that there was a deliberate attempt to forget that he did come from an extremely misogynist father. His father beat his mother. His father was not religious, was not a religious Muslim, and I am not saying Muslims are inherently violent. What I'm saying is that from a media point of view, that just was not going to fly, because it interfered with the more important feminist message that men are bad and women are always victims. The second part, the fact that the men allowed it to happen, I can't comment on that, because in the shock of this happening, it's very hard to say I would have or they should have. So I'm a little leery about saying that that is a factor, the emasculation thing. You know, I just don't want to say that.
There was I'm not saying they're identical, but some years ago, I was a very young man at the time, there was a terrorist group in Northern Ireland who stopped a bus of workers going to a job, and they asked all the Catholics to get out. And the Protestants said, no, we're together. Now, it was everyone was killed in the end. It was absolutely horrible. But it was a group of people who said, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to separate. We are here together.
What a great thing.
And that is not without precedent. There are other people who said, no, you're not going to do this. And well, I'm not blaming any group for bringing this situation about, but it's an interesting observation, I think.
Yes, well, it's tricky to comment on these things, because it was quite a, I mean, it was a fairly unique situation, and by the way, unlike Ireland, violence in general in Quebec is, it's a very peaceful place, Quebec. So this was kind of unprecedented on so many levels, that to blame people for not acting in a more, as if they had thought it out, or as if they were already familiar with situations like this, I think it's asking a lot.
Okay.
So I'll back off that. I won't.
The one thing you've ever backed off.
No, I'm. You know, when I don't know, I'm the first one to admit it. And
oh, it's never stopped me. Back in a few moments on the Michael Coren Show. We'll see you soon. Don't go away. Don't go away. Welcome back. Michael Coren Show, and it's half-time, and we sort of reintroduced the panel at half-time, but it's a little bit redundant here because it's only Barbara Kay. Only Barbara Kay. It is just the single person. Barbara Kay, columnist with the National Post. Let's move subject. You mentioned victim groups, the cult of victimhood that women have achieved.